We are coming to the end of the school year, and now is usually the time that school boards table their budgets for the year ahead. We've reported a lot on the Surrey Board of Education, where they passed their $1.1 billion budget for the 2025-26 school year. But it had to make some big cuts in the face of a $16 million shortfall. Now, Surrey is the fastest growing school district in BC, but it is not the only one facing a deficit. Early Edition story producer Caroline Chan has been looking into this, and she joins us in studio this morning. Good morning to you, Caroline.
Good morning.
So school districts in the province have to pass a balanced budget every year. They're not allowed to run deficits. What more can you tell us about that?
So that's right. They are mandated to pass a balanced budget, but not without some sacrifices. Now, every school district is different and they all have their own challenges, but it seems more and more are struggling to stretch their provincial funding dollars. I focused mainly on school districts here in the Lower Mainland and Fraser Valley, but this budget problem seems to be province-wide. I asked Laura Kwong, the chair of the new Westminster District Parent Advisory Council, whether this is money mismanagement.
It's actually not a sudden a case of every secretary treasurer in BC suddenly forgetting how to do their job. This is just what systemic underfunding looks like on a provincial scale. This is how it plays out. I don't think that public education is a cost. It's an investment, and that's the values and the principle behind almost every educator working in the public system.
So that's Laura Kwong, the chair of the new West DPAC.
Okay, so if it's not the mismanagement of money, then why are all these school districts struggling to balance their budgets?
Well, I asked someone who is involved with balancing the budget at the Bernabby School District. It's Bernabby Board of Education Chair Kristen Schneider. She says despite the current government putting more money into education than ever before, it's still coming up short.
There's never been more money in public education, but there have never been more students. And quite frankly, the other driving factor of the funding for public education is actually tied to labor settlement costs. So as we get better agreements at the table and salaries increase, there's a corresponding increase to operating dollars. What is not being addressed, which still in our view needs to be addressed, is the formula-driven operating per student funding formula that we've all talked about for decades, about how it really needs to catch up with the current realities, with inflation, with all the costs of services and supplies. Enrollment is one piece, and obviously with more students will come more money. And with collective agreement settlements costs, obviously salaries are going up. So more money is definitely coming into districts, but it's not addressing that systemic shortfall that we've had because the funding formula hasn't been touched for so long.
Kristen says it's complicated funding. It's a complicated funding formula that's pegged to the students. There's a base amount and there's additional funding if the student require more support. But those amounts are not keeping up with rising costs. Kristen calls this a perfect storm of cost pressures, which includes some that you might not even think of, like school districts have to pay for their own portables. For Bernabby, that came to $7.5 million over 3 years.
Wow.
There's the benefit premium costs that districts are having to pay for employees. There's the implications of temporary resident registration. So for any student who enrolls in a school after September 30th, the schools don't get any funding from the province. So last year, Kristen said they had around 430 students join in October to the end of the calendar year. Because they enrolled after the cutoff, they got no funding. So to put that into context, Burnaby's Cameron Elementary has 546 students. So 430 is pretty much a whole other school.
Right, with no per student funding.
No.
Okay. See all that adding up. So with school districts then having to make these very difficult decisions, what is the impact on kids in the classroom?
For this, I turn to Martin Dimitrieff, the president of the Maple Ridge Teachers Association. He says it's the more vulnerable students that are losing out.
We're looking at cuts to further education assistant funding, which is going to even more impact the really important services to those complex learners, the ones that are vulnerable to perhaps not keeping up with their peers without those extra supports. It's even affecting, for instance, our child and youth care worker staffing in our local schools. They're being hit. So that's another service that is primarily for those that are of socioeconomic vulnerability in our community, for instance. We're looking at teacher counseling time that's not keeping up with needs either, where we're not staffing as much for these extra blocks for our teacher counselors, again, that is specific to working with the needs of vulnerable students. So I have very strong issues with our learners not getting their needs met, and especially when it's impacting our vulnerable students, because that impacts equity of access.
So Martin says these cuts to services for students means teachers are having to pick up the slack, and that's having bigger consequences.
Teachers are therefore expected to pick up the slack, to increase their workload. And I was just reviewing, we did an intensive survey of our membership, the BCTF, last year, and it's 16% of teachers reported that they would be likely quitting teaching in the next 2 years. And it's primarily around things like heavy workload, not enough support for our complex learners, the exact things that are currently in the budget situation that is the pinch point, right?
That's Martin Dmitrieff, the president of the Maple Ridge Teachers Association. So, Stephen, something to keep in mind. The BC Teachers Federation collective agreement with the BC Public School Employers Association expires at the end of next month. They have started negotiations, so we'll see if some of the issues are addressed in the new agreement. And also, here's something that's telling. SD 42, which is the Maple Ridge Pitt Meadows School District, they passed their balanced budget last month, but it wasn't unanimous. 2 trustees out of the 7 voted against it because of the deep cuts.
If this, Caroline, is systemic underfunding, which is what it sounds like, why does it feel so acute right now?
Well, remember, these school districts are mandated to balance their budgets every year.
Yeah.
So they've been finding ways to do it. And it seems like most have already cut what they can over the years. Here's Christian Schneider, the chair of the Bernabby Board of Education again.
We're seeing these shortfalls across the province. We're seeing districts literally having to cut millions of dollars because we're not able to keep up. In past years, we've been able to supplement funding by having healthy reserve fundings. In Burnaby's context, our reserve is essentially depleted. We're projecting to have about roughly $30,000 remaining at the end of this school year.
Wow, right? So Kristen says they're supposed to have about 1 to 3% in their
Yeah.
reserves. So for a district like Burnaby, that should be about $3 million. So that gives you an idea of how much they've had to dip into the reserves to keep going. She says the board is struggling to cut with reach programs and services, not because they don't see their inherent value, but it's really for the sake of staying in the black. Burnaby School District is looking at a $4.2 million shortfall. They've postponed their budget meeting to next Tuesday to give staff enough time to consult with everyone about what they can cut to balance this budget.
And so, what is being done about this?
Well, the province is the one holding the purse strings here, so there are rallies being held all over to raise awareness about the situation. Laura Kwong, the chair of the New West DPAC, who we heard earlier, she's part of these rallies. I asked her if she had the ear of the Education Minister, Lisa Bear. Here's what she had to say.
I'm not an expert, but I am talking to people that are experts, the families who are experts in their own children's educational needs, the educators, the EAs who are experts in what does it take to provide inclusive education. I am talking to senior administrators who are experts in understanding the funding needs of their district, and I would ask the Minister of Education to listen to those experts. And to take a holistic look at funding education from a top-down approach. If we can identify what the costs of delivering inclusive education in right-sized schools, so schools that aren't portables on portables on portables with no greenfield left, and safe schools that don't have deferred maintenance, they don't have leaky roofs, they don't, they're not, ill-equipped to deal with changing climate. If we looked at the costs of what that is, and then said this is how much we need to fund public education for, and then allocated it out, I think that's where we need to be, instead of this bottom-up approach where they're saying here's this piece of pie that you get from Treasury, and they just divvy it up, and so everyone's fighting over scraps, and it becomes who can shout the loudest, whose needs are positioned as being most critical. I think a total reframing of how to fund public education from a needs-based approach would be the answer.
Now, Laura Kwong, the chair of the new West DPAC, may not think she's an expert, but she's a mom of 3 in the public school system, and she has certainly done her homework.
And how are you feeling about digging into all of this?
Well, I've been sitting with this for about a week now, and I don't have children, so this has kind of been a crash course in public education funding.
Right.
And the whole thing is so nuanced and so complex. But what I heard was a lot of heart, that those in the school system, be they parents, teachers, school board trustees, all they want is what's best for students. But what I've told you here is just a quick overview. In the following weeks, we're going to pull at the different threads about how we got here with our public education system. So this is not the end of the conversation, Stephen.
Very happy to continue this conversation. It's very important. Caroline, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Caroline Chan, story producer with us on the Early Edition.